is a very interesting alternative approach to looking at network infrastructure security. Give a warm welcome to Raven.
All right, I have to say, did any of y'all have any fun last night? Because this is a lot of people for first thing in the morning. I'm flattered, but oh my God. So, hello, I'm Raven, and I do pen testing, among other things, for a living. I used to be an ISP engineer. I did that for about 5 years and helped to run a pretty major backbone, and got annoyed at their lack of caring about security after repeated thunks to the head, and became a security consultant, like I'm sure about 80% of you. And one of the things that I have really enjoyed over the last 5 years is including backbones and infrastructure in my penetration testing, because almost no one does it. It's really poorly secured most of the time, so you get this weird mix of, oh my God, this is totally basic, I got this in the first 5 minutes, and wow, what the hell is this protocol? Okay, let's try and disassemble it and figure out what it is. So it's really all over the map, but just to give me an idea, how many of you guys have done penetration testing, either amateur or professional? All right, cool. So we have mostly going to be familiar with the basic concepts of how you run a penetration test. Any network engineers in the house? All the same people. All right. So what I'm going to do is give you basically an outline of what you're going to cover and what you're going to commonly see during an attack on the backbone. And I'm going to throw in some war stories of stupid, horrible things that I've come across, and bad things that have happened to other people. And after we've done about 20-25 minutes of that, we're going to flip and talk about, okay, so if you own this network, how do you keep this from happening to you? What do you look for? What lets you know that someone is on your backbone crawling around messing with your stuff? And we're going to wrap up with, okay, so where is this field going? What are the new challenges? What are the things that people need to be working on that are not necessarily being done by everyone? And how do you come up with like a custom way of attacking something if all your old standbys are not working? And for those of you who have done pen testing before, it's really the similar skill set. It's just with different tools and a couple of caveats, like if you break things, people get really, really mad. Yeah, had that happen. So, the first slide, which I kindly call the duh slide, why do you even care? Well, since the backbone is in the middle of most of your data transit, if you control it, you can reroute data, you can take copies of data, you can possibly alter things, do all your man-in-the-middle crypto attacks. You have a wide range of possibility. Now, a lot of people have not focused attention on this because they don't understand it. It's like hand-wavy ISP stuff, but it's really not that difficult, and it's really not that different from what a lot of you guys do day to day. So one of the reasons I left ISP engineering is, like I said earlier, repeated kicks to the head of, but what about this? And they didn't care. And that's gotten kind of better since a couple of years ago with that whole Mike Lynn Cisco Gate thing. People kind of freaked out then, but by and large, in many places, there's still a whole lot of apathy among ISPs and telco providers. They just assume that no one's going to attack their stuff. They're still running Telnet rather than SSH. They're allowing the whole world to Telnet to their backbone routers, and their password is Cisco, and they're like, no one's touching this. This is uber safe. So a lot of the time, you have less risk of being detected, oddly, unless you break something, if you're having a run at the backbone than you do if you're having a run at somebody's database server. There's less in the way to watch you, there's less in the way to report if there's logging violations, and there's less in the way of people actually caring and looking at those logs. And so as long as you don't cause an operational problem, a lot of people are going to be clueless. So for those of you who are pen testers, you pretty much already know what to do. You do your reconnaissance, you try and figure out who it is that you're going to be approaching, you do your Google searches, you look for names of points of contact, you look for, messages from their admin saying, gee, I just can't figure out BGP. Can anyone tell me? Here's my config. All the stuff like that. And there's just a couple of additional things that you need to add to your reconnaissance that are network specific. For example, if you can find out who they peer with, there's a lot of route servers, there are public peering points that announce who peers with whom, you can figure out who's there, and if you're doing an external pen test, then you can try and figure out if it's in the scope of your engagement, if it's okay to mess with their peering, if it's okay to impersonate a peer, if it's okay to inject routes via a peer that they trust, things like that. You can look at route servers, which will give you a listing of how you see things from the perspective of Border Gateway Protocol, the major routing protocol on the internet, from a given point. So if you're trying to figure out how a route is being propagated through the internet, you can look at it from 5 or 6 different points and say, okay, we see it being passed here to here to here. And if you're doing an attack that is focused on getting in the middle of them and somewhere else they're routing to, then you know where it's going and where your possible injection points are. For social engineering, just like any other pen test, if they are dumb enough to list the name of a human point of contact in their registrar and social engineering is in your test, then you can call it and say, yeah, I'm totally Bob Jones and I need the backbone password right now. Hopefully a little more sophisticated than that, but you get the idea. You gather data, you map your target, you figure out what they've got and where you want to attack it, what the known vulnerabilities are for what you know they have, and that's a good starting point. Other important things to know, if you can figure it out from any of the above or from things like Nmap, what hardware they're using, what version of software, you can throw that version into the open source vulnerability database and get a whole bunch of problems spit out right back at you that may be useful, and what management or routing protocols. And we'll hit that later. Now, there are some problems with doing good backbone reconnaissance. When you throw Nmap at it, it's not always going to pick the exact version. Part of this is because there are a lot of stacks that look similar, especially when they're doing relatively minimal things and they're based off the same basic operating system. And so it's hard to pinpoint specific versions. Part of it also is that people have not fed the databases for projects like that with as much data on backbone stuff as they have on end servers, just because there's fewer people looking at this, so they feed it and say, it's some Cisco. And then when you get your result, it's like Cisco version 10.4 to 12.3. Great, that helps. So if you're doing this kind of thing and you feel like doing your civic good deed for the day, if you know what version is on a given box, just throw the fingerprint to Theodore and make Nmap a little better on this. It would really help me out. But because you can't get as clear fingerprints from the operating system, and especially if it's behind a firewall or something like that and it's not running many services to the outside world, you can sometimes figure it out through the management protocols or specific ones. There's one that's commonly used on Cisco devices, and in particular their voice over IP infrastructure called CDP, Cisco Discovery Protocol. That is great for debugging and great for me when I have my attacker hat on, and just awful if I have my network engineer hat on. It will gleefully announce out of its link, hey, I'm running this version of software and I've got this version of this and this version of that, and here's my OpenSSL, and by the way, here's the capabilities of my device just in case you wanted to know. And so that can be very useful. We're going to talk a little bit later about a suite of tools that you can use to speak that back from a Unix box and tell it that you're whatever you want to be. But just from an information mining perspective, that is just gold information. Another thing that a lot of people don't look at when they're doing backbone testing, most places that are really concerned with redundancy have some kind of out-of-band network. And the people who have a lot of money will have a totally separate network with totally separate T1s or E1s or what have you, connecting everything. But the people who are not quite so rich will generally have a modem, and you'll dial into it and it'll connect you at 9600 to whatever device is there. War dialing lives again. There have been many cases where I've been doing a backbone pen test, and I've been hammering on their devices. They've got good perimeter security. They're not allowing anyone from just anywhere on the internet to access their devices correctly. But hey, they have an out-of-band modem, and you can just dial right up, and there's not even a password on that thing. So, the major areas that you want to focus on when you're doing backbone infrastructure, and the other disclaimers. If you do this, make sure that if you're doing this professionally, make sure that you have like an ironclad contract of it's not my fault if your whole network goes down. Because about 90% of the known attacks out there on backbone devices are denial of service. And while you may not mean to do that, there are cases where it's a really good thing tactically, like to knock over someone's authentication server, and then, you know, if their fallback password is Cisco or something delightful like that, it might be worth your while to knock over the infrastructure. But make sure you scope really carefully, because a lot of clients will say, oh yeah, do anything, have at it, you know, and they don't really mean that. They don't know what that means. There was one engagement where they swore up and down that they absolutely meant do anything, you know, absolutely any kind of tactics were fine. We had all of this in paperwork, it was notarized, you know, I had my hi, I'm not going to jail card. So we needed physical access to their devices for an injection attack we wanted to do. So we went outside to their DMARC, we cut their line, we waited 10 minutes. I went in with a telephone company hat on and said, hey, I hear you're having some trouble. Right in. And when we delivered our report, they were very upset about that. So really, you want to make sure that when they say anything, they mean it. You explain to them what that involves. All right, so major things you're going to look at. The big one that gets you in more than anything else, weak passwords. It's lame, it's boring, and it totally works. You know, people will have lists of default passwords and they'll change their default to like default 1. There's a lot of tools, you know, good old Hydra will have a go at many backbone devices. There's a Cisco specific device or script called Cisco Torch that some Russian dudes wrote. And we're starting to see proliferation of tools that will specifically attack passwords of these devices. But I'd say about half the backbone pops I do are because of that. And maybe 1 in 3 is in the first 5 minutes because someone left Cisco on there. A lot of places do that as like some lame attempt at support because they don't want to give their real password to like Cisco's TAC, so they just leave Cisco for when the Cisco guys need to get into it, so they don't have to give them anything real, and they don't really think that other people might be able to use that. Yeah. Poorly defended web or administration interfaces. A lot of these admin interfaces, they have the same problems that any other web app that you app testers might run across does. You know, a lot of them allow cross-site scripting or things like that. You can get a little custom phishing going on and steal someone's legitimate login and then use that to get in afterwards. Social engineering, you all know what that is. Authentication server hijacking, which is one of my other favorites. People don't realize that it's not the best idea to put the keys to the kingdom on an ancient like Windows NT box that's sitting naked out on the internet since 1997 or so. And so a lot of the time you can either pop the box itself, like somewhere in the operating system, some other service that's operating, or you can hit the authentication service itself. A lot of them will run over UDP, they will trust things when they oughtn't to, you can just knock them over with denial of service. You know, again, zillions and zillions of denial of service for that. And depending on what you want to do, you can either replace it with a server of your own that just happens to be on that same segment, or you can just hope that they fall back to whatever their fallback is, usually a local password on the device, which you can then try and crack. Which kind of leads into the tactical denial of service and infrastructure replacement. Authentication servers I found are the best things to do that to, but it's also sometimes useful for an edge router if you can get enough throughput connectivity so that people will only notice the momentary blip rather than a whole, hey, why can't I get to the whole internet? Placement is going to be really key for that, and we'll talk about the importance of that later on. Protocol sniffing. It is a lot easier than you think. ISP people tend to dismiss the possibility of sniffing because they're like, oh, you have to get in line, you have to be able to see that. Well, if they don't make any configuration errors, sure. But getting in line, especially with the advent of wireless, is not as hard as it used to be. And a lot of people don't realize where they're speaking out their protocols and where the edge of their network is and where they don't really need to put that. There's the direct attack and overflow thing. Okay, so Mike Lynn isn't here. If anyone else comes up with a direct overflow in a major like infrastructure iOS, I'll be really impressed. But I think we're going to see more of that coming as the reverse engineers get cracking on these infrastructure devices. And finally, there is routing manipulation, which requires a little bit more knowledge of what's going on, what protocol they're using, how it authenticates, and if it broadcasts or just accepts data from anywhere. But we'll get into that a little bit later. That one's fun. All right, so boring stuff first. Weak passwords. Defaults everywhere. The Pheno Elite guys have a fantastic, gigantic list of the default passwords for almost every device you are likely to come across. And so if you nmap SV something and you find out that it's some bizarro box you never heard of, give that list a look. It's worth it. You will occasionally luck out and find the defaults. And I found that the weirder the piece of equipment is, the more likely you are to find the defaults on it. Like, a lot of people, they get something that they don't really understand. It's like, some Bay router switch from 1995, and they're just, okay, whatever, plug it in, leave it alone, that's hard, we're gonna not touch it. And a lot of administration folks don't think that they need to limit the access to these devices, which is obviously bad. In an ideal world, and we'll talk about this a bit in the defense section, but only the people who are managing your network should be able to talk to your routers and switches directly. I mean, anyone who's on the segment should be able to pass packets through according to its policy, but, Joe Bob and Jane Bob out there do not need to be SSHing into my router. They've got no call for that. And there are still many major ISPs that have their ports open to the entire internet, which is just stupid. If you manage to get an encrypted password for these devices, say you maybe own an end station or something and it's got the configuration backups for the backbone, that happens a lot too. For the simple authentication, like Cisco has this old encryption called 7 encryption, and it's ghetto. I mean, you can decode it on a napkin. It is bad. There are web pages out there, and they said that it wasn't actually intended to be encryption. It was just so that shoulder surfers wouldn't actually see your password. But if people are depending on that for security in their configuration, they really shouldn't. A lot more vendors are going towards MD5 passwords, and the nice thing about those is that even if you get enough access to the routers that you can see the config or you find a config file somewhere, you can just pull out the MD5 hash and format it and throw it into John the Ripper, just like a FreeBSD line or a Unix line, and boom, it'll crack it just the same. So if they have rotten passwords, good for you. And of course, there are programs like Hydra or Cisco Torch that we mentioned earlier that will allow you to attack them directly. Web and admin interfaces. Try your basic cookie manipulation, because a lot of them will depend on that. There was one custom app that, swear to God, it set a cookie and said logged in equals false. So I changed the cookie to logged in equals true, and oh my God, I had admin on their entire devices. It's just bad. So a lot of these things that you already know how to do that you don't think might work, give it a shot. They might just work. There are various little admin protocols that different kinds of devices use, and most of them have not been very well thought out. They'll use kick and encryption like XOR or ROT13, and you have, the ability to reverse that pretty quickly. There's this nice little Firefox extension called LeapKey that you can just highlight something and then you can manipulate it in like 8 different ways, and it's just worth checking sometimes. Was that a question, or you just... Okay, cool. And another thing, with passwords and the web interfaces, people reuse passwords all the time. If you get one somewhere in a pen test, try it on the backbone. You never know. And if you have an intelligent cracker, feed everything that you've got into that so it will try permutations of those passwords, because there have been plenty of times when the server password is I'm so cool and the backbone password is I'm so cool 42. So yeah, not really so cool. Social engineering with a backbone spin. And I don't know much about the European laws. Many places in the US are trying to pass laws to outlaw doing this sort of thing. So, if you're doing this professionally, make sure that you're not going to get your company in trouble. But A really commonly successful one is to call up some junior admin, tell them that you're from the registrar and that you need to validate that they're using all their IP addresses or you're going to take them away. And they freak out and get upset and you say, all right, let me log into one of your routers, I'll dump the routing table and we'll make sure that you're using everything you say. And they go, huh, okay. Yeah. And for anything that requires physical access, a shiny telecommunications company hat goes a really long way. One of the companies I worked for had a suite of uniforms. We had the FedEx uniform, we had the telephone company uniform, we had the generic office girl uniform, and especially if they happen to be having an outage because someone unplugged their line at the DMARC, then they're very happy to see you and they'll just let you right in. But social engineering, other people can do whole giant talks on that. So one of my favorite things to do is to hijack the authentication server. And almost without exception, these things tend to run on multi-purpose boxes that are doing 10 million things, and they're not really in well-protected areas of the network. Now, for any of you that have done network design, this is obviously dumb. However, it's also what happens. People think of Radius and they think of TACACS and they're like, oh yeah, it goes on our utility box and it just gets thrown on something ancient. So it is worthwhile trying to discover, and if you can port scan and if you have access and you're not blocked by a firewall, and then you can see the ports open on these, so it's not exactly hard to pick it out. Or if you notice that you're trying to go to a web page and you're getting redirected and you can see from the redirection box, sometimes if you can pop that one where it's going to and get the authentication server. So your standard pen tester's toolkit will help you out for that. And if you own the authentication server, you're golden. You can grant yourself access to anything that queries it, and sometimes a little bit more. Again, with the social engineering, there was one pen test where my team and I owned the authentication server, but only about half of their boxes were authenticating to it. So we sent out an email from the email server that we had compromised saying, all right, everyone must move to the new standard. All of you guys have to roll out TACACS by the end of next week. And they did it, so we had the whole network. Don't underestimate the power of having central authentication. It's great for administrative control, but you really want to make sure that that box is well protected or bad things happen. And authentication servers also are often very, very prone to denial of service attacks. Again, the ancient box running 20 million services, that tends to help. But even if you look up TACACS or Radius or a lot of the other common auth servers, just throw it into the open source vulnerability database, you'll get tons and tons of stuff coming back. And if you can get access to the physical segment, you can have your own little authentication server ready to go. So you knock theirs offline, you light yours up, and there you go. You are now in charge of who gets where for the whole network. And we've done that pretty successfully. If you have wireless, this is so much easier. You can sit in the parking lot and do it. They're not fun with that. And this sort of tactic will also work for other devices like your edge routers. If you want to make sure that you intercept a certain type of traffic, you can insert yourself into the middle by DOSing the router and assuming that you have an uplink to send them to, then passing traffic through your laptop. Also worth noticing, a lot of places will have a failover path, and they will spend what security money and time they have on the main path. But if they have to switch over to their backup failover, then that may not be as well protected. So if you can trigger a failover, then you can have an easier time of attacking. So, protocol sniffing. I don't imagine that many of you were in New York last summer, but I did a really interesting bit of research with a couple of friends of mine where we solicited PCAPs from people who had done war driving, and we parsed through the results looking for backbone protocol specifically. Now, this is not something that you should expect to see in people's random wireless captures. Unfortunately, we came across quite a bit of that, and we saw probably about 1% of the traffic was backbone or management traffic. And that's not a huge number, but its impact is disproportionate. I mean, we saw people with their passwords for these routing protocols. We saw really bad passwords that should not have been allowed out. And we responsibly went through and told people. And in one absolutely stellar case, I got a reply that said, well, you can't expect us to change that password. That's in deployment globally. It would be very hard for us to change that very important password that you've got totally sitting in clear text on your laptop and in your slides. So, yeah, you wouldn't expect wireless to be successful, but a lot of people are now placing it in important points, and they don't realize that when you have a routing protocol running, you should set it to passive on the interfaces that are just facing the edge network, so it's not speaking routing protocol out that interface, because if it is, it's advertising not only what routing protocol you're using and what version of it, but a lot of the time, if there is any sort of authentication, it's, clear text right in the packet. So I can read it and go, oh yeah, sure, I'm gonna join the Minerva network too. And it works. Also, a lot of the routing protocols that are out there, they find other routers by using broadcast. So it's not like, except for BGP where you actually have to say, this is my neighbor, I'm going to set up a BGP session between me and this router over here. Most of the other routing protocols are just like, okay, anyone speaking OSPF? Anyone Minerva? Minerva? Polo? Bueller? And anyone who speaks with that same clear text token back to them is now allowed to, according to whatever policy they've got, which is usually not much, add routes. And that can be destructive or interesting in a variety of ways that we'll get to. So direct attack and overflow. It's possible. A guy named Mike Lynn demonstrated it, not this past summer, but the one before at Black Hat, and he had a working exploit against a router remote overflow. We haven't seen any other public ones since then, but people certainly try things. Like even 7 or 8 years ago when I was working backbone ISP stuff, we saw weird things in our logs that didn't really make sense and shouldn't have been. And I don't think that they were necessarily actual overflows, but I think someone was sure trying. Good sources for looking at those are memory management bugs. Like the IPv6 flaw that Mike Lynn exploited was a mishandling of the heap. And there are watchdog processes within a lot of these operating systems that will go back and check and say, is my heap corrupt? Oh my God, it is. I'm totally going to crash. But those can be subverted. Lynn managed to do it, and Cisco has fixed their internals since then, but there are other people working on that kind of thing. The other problem, so any memory management bug is a likely candidate to start trying at least. They're not all going to work, obviously, and you have to be able to defeat the heap checker, whatever stack protection mechanisms there are in the operating system you're attacking. But it's still worth investigating. And the other problem is that a lot of these systems will take existing code and incorporate it in. So when someone finds a flaw in, say, OpenSSL, many infrastructure vendors who have incorporated the OpenSSL code, now they all have to patch, and they're usually not as fast as OpenSSL. And there are sometimes this big delays in the incident response coordination because, some big, huge, important 100-pound gorilla has not gotten their act together, and so they don't want to release until everyone's ready to patch, but sometimes it takes a long time. And if you look at the versions of the software that are included in a lot of the infrastructure operating systems, they're usually pretty behind. And so bugs that will work against the main code base with relatively small modification can often be made to work against the embedded devices as well. So, routing manipulation. Here's the fun stuff. So if you can peer with a router, you can usually manipulate the routing tables. Now, it is possible for admins to set routing policy and say, I'm only going to accept these routes from this guy, and I'm only going to accept these other routes from this person, and I'll announce my routes to Joe over here, but I'm not going to listen to anything he has to say. But in practice, the people who do that are usually the large ISPs, and they mostly only care about BGP. The internal routing protocols that are only within your own network, those are supposed to be trusted, and so a lot of people will just trust them blindly. They'll either divide them into areas and use that for like management and segmentation, or they'll just assume that everything internal is okay. And there are fine suites out there that will allow you to run routers software on your laptop. There's a suite called Zebra that speaks many of the protocols out there. There's some that are proprietary to a given vendor. For example, EIGRP, until fairly recently, was not available in that sort of form, but there's a Perl script that will do that sort of EIGRP manipulation for you. We'll get to that in the tools slide a little bit later. So one of the key things is that since a more specific route is usually preferred to a less specific route, when people are advertising their aggregate blocks, if you want to steal part of that, you can just inject into their routing protocol, oh, you're advertising the /24? Dude, I totally have that /29. And you will get the route in most places. A lot of this is going to be context particular, but general guidelines, this is worth trying. Now, if you hijack someone's whole subnet, they'll probably notice. So if you're trying to be stealthy, this is not the way to go. They may not know what's going on, and it may take them a little bit to figure it out. But if you want to do something just particular as one machine and you can't crack that machine, you can always try getting the subnet, have a machine with that address, send your stuff, get your reply, drop back off. Oh, and suddenly the internet is back, and they don't know what happened, but it's back now. That's okay. And that happens a lot too. A stealthier thing that you can do is if you can map their network and you know what IP space they have, but you can see a block that they are not using but that they own, you can announce that within their internal routing protocol. And because of route redistribution, a fair bit of the time, people will take their internal routing protocols and announce that out, or just announce their whole block out. So your block will be just sort of sucked up into that, and you'll have a legitimate block of space within their address space from which you can do whatever you want. There's a really nasty version of this that happened to an American mining company where it wasn't done from within their network, but they had someone join up at another ISP and say that they owned these guys' existing net block. And because of the way that BGP was at the time, they had a lot more pull. So their existing net block went to these other people, and they spammed, they sent a bunch of viruses, and they did a whole bunch of wicked evil stuff. Meanwhile, the people who actually own the net block are like, hey, we'd like our internet back. Why won't anyone route to us? It took a couple of weeks to get it cleaned up. And once they did, they had a whole lot of people ticked off at them for all that spam and all that malware and all that stuff they sent out. And they were on every blacklist on the planet. And their space was basically useless because no one would accept mail from them. Everyone thought they were jerks, and they got a whole lot of hate mail. And, while the global routing community has taken steps to make that harder, it's still possible, and that's really nasty. To make this worse for the, worse for the defender, better for the attacker, a lot of infrastructure devices, if they log at all, they log locally. So assuming that you manage to pop the password on the device, you can just go, hey, clear the log. Oh my God, it's like I've never been hacked at all. And that's all the record they had. So they have no forensics, they have no way to track it. If they do log centrally, a lot of the time they just spit out to syslog, and the syslog server is wide open to anywhere, and so it's not that difficult to get on there also, or alternatively, send it a whole bunch of junk so that it just crashes. A lot of people don't watch the router logs either, so it's there. They just, unless something horrible happens and they're digging through, not so much. And a lot of them will only log access list failures and local events on the router. So if you do something like taking a unused local subnet and adding it, that's not going to show up in their logs. That's okay behavior, which, okay. So here's the tools slide. And there's a Perl script that the Russian guys who did the Hacking Cisco Networks Exposed book wrote so that you can actually speak EIGRP. And all these slides are going to be on the conference website, so you people frantically writing down don't have to write quite so frantically. There's Zebra Suite, which will allow you to speak OSPF. There's a tool called Yersinia, which will allow you to attack a lot of the layer 2 things, the hot standby router protocols, Cisco Discovery Protocol that we talked about. Pheno Elite has written some pretty decent tools, and Cisco Torch, which was the brute forcer and vulnerability checker, sort of in quotes. It checks for like 4 vulnerabilities, but it's a very young tool and is being developed. So I'm sure as they find more vulnerabilities, they'll add them in. There's CDP tools, which is available off of FreshMeat, and that allows you to live from a Unix box and speak CDP. And you can just say, hey, I'm a phone. No, wait, I'm a router. No, wait, I'm a switch. I'm a washing machine. Okay, there's no washing machine option, but you get the idea. And then you can brute force with Hydra or Nmap or Nmap. So that's most of the attack side. We're going to breeze through defense really quickly because it's 101 stuff. And then we will round up with what we need to look at next and where the active areas of research in backbone hacking are. So if you folks are pen testers, there aren't many people out there right now looking at this. It's more popular than it used to be because of Cisco-gate, but you guys totally have the skill set to work on this. And it makes a nice add-on to your pen test as long as you're upfront with the client about, hey, is this okay that we hit your infrastructure? We won't do denial of service if you're not cool with that, but you really need to get this checked out. And for people on the inside, it's often trivial. Like, when I was an ISP engineer, if I had gone postal and gotten disgruntled, I could have wreaked a whole lot of damage. And there's very little protection against that. There's also a book out that specifically focuses on infrastructure stuff, and that came out like mid last year or so. I don't know how it's doing sale-wise, but I know I got my copy on like day 2. Okay, so if you're the defender, test stuff, design audit, make sure that you treat your infrastructure like important servers. They have to be subject to the same, do they need patching? Is this code recent? Do I need to do anything like it? Include them in your policy and incident response plans so that you're not completely blindsided if some person in Nigeria takes out your backbone. Talk with the ISP about security responsiveness, because a lot of the time, if you're the end user, there's not a lot you can do about a denial of service or something like that if your pipe is full. You need to make sure that if there is a backbone incident that you have support from your provider before things get really bad. Network people as area-specific contacts for whatever they're responsible for, log verbosely, log securely, log all over the place and save it for a long time, log not just failures, and this should be included in the existing security policy. Check for leaking information, because a lot of people have no idea that they are advertising their backbone routing protocol passwords to the whole world. I got a couple of confused emails when we did that wireless project, and wrote people and said, hey, look, you really don't want to be doing this. They're like, how did you know? They just don't audit it, they don't check, and they don't realize that not setting external interfaces passive is going to mean that by default, in most cases, you will be speaking that protocol out of that interface. Use encryption when you can, use separate management networks when you can, use non-crappy encryption. So if you have the option of SSH2 versus SSH1, take the little teeny hit to your processor and do it. And if you have devices that don't support it, and you're in a position to pressure the vendor, yell at the vendor. Tell them, hey, we want SSH. We want something that we can manage this securely. Have you heard about what they're doing out there on the internet? It's bad. For your routing protocols in particular, for BGP, use MD5 authentication. That will save you from Paul Watson's windowing attack of like 2003, 2004 or so. It will save you from a lot of the nasty hijack stuff people do. The only bad thing about BGP MD5 auth is it has to be set simultaneously on both sides of a session. You can't set it on one side and then wait a couple of hours and set it on the other side and expect that to continue. So there is a bit of a syncing problem with your peers, but that's how it goes. It will make it a lot harder if you use authentication protocols and the best that's available for whatever protocol that you're speaking. It will make it a lot harder for me to come in with my little wireless router on a stick and cause you some problems. As far as backbone and stuff is concerned, unless we're talking like, point-to-point microwave links or something, wireless is just bad. Keep your access point far away from the middle of your infrastructure. You don't need everyone in a 2-block radius to see it. It's not just like not securing your data, it's actually advertising. It is screaming out to the world, hey, here's what I've got. And nobody bring up web. Protect your authentication servers. This is important. We talked about that. Choose good passwords. Defense in depth, IDS, blah, blah, blah. You guys know this. Oh, filter. Not just who can access your infrastructure devices, but also filter what you will allow people to speak to you. For example, don't let anyone who is in the outside world announce 10net to you. That shouldn't be happening. Even worse, don't let them announce your net space to you. It's happened. It worked. Only announce your own net blocks out. Egress filtering will catch people on the inside of your network trying to do things they oughtn't to. If you are watching what you're advertising and I go and add in a subnet, you should be able to catch that. And it's worthwhile to think about bogon filtering. Bogons are net blocks that are not allocated to anyone yet. And it's another old trick to grab an unallocated net block and start speaking it and see who will take it. And a lot of the time it works because people just don't want to go through the pain of updating a list of unallocated net blocks every so often when one gets allocated. But if you can spare the management time, it's really worthwhile. Patch your software regularly when something bad happens, and also just, on your whatever your normal patch cycle is. It's important. I know it's a pain, but it needs to be done. There are some excellent templates for how to lock down your devices. These are the secure router and secure BGP templates for both iOS and Juniper networks. You can follow the principles in them for other devices, but these actually give you command by command. Here is what to type in, here is what you get. And they're very, very helpful. So if you only remember one slide, remember this slide if you're a network defender type. So if I'm crawling around on your backbone, how are you going to know? Uptime and availability issues are one of the first ones. If you see like a sudden reboot and you didn't reboot anything and you don't know of any problems, that might be worth checking out. If it's not an intruder, it's likely to be a problem. And either way, not very good. Sudden spikes in processor and memory are also common. A lot of the people who are out there hacking routers because they want to be a script kiddie and use it to packet someone off of IRC, you'll suddenly see the processor and the usage on that router go way, way up because they're using it to knock some noob off the internet. And if you're watching your monitoring software, you can pick this up. Also, vulnerability disclosures or vendor notifications, you'll often see a spike in scanning for whatever it is that just got announced. So if there's something that got announced on an infrastructure device, you might want to keep an eye out. All right, so new areas of research, things that I'm going to be looking at soon and I know other people are and that are worthwhile. Backbone and management cryptography implementation testing. Basically, the reason I haven't done this one in depth is that I don't have the, tens of thousands of dollars of gear. But a lot of the implementations out there, they'll take like a chunk of OpenSSL, but not the whole thing. And they'll implement parts of it, but not others. And I'm pretty sure that there are some decent crypto bugs that could fall out. Like even if you use just the University of Finland's SSL testing suite or something like that against a lot of these devices, I think you'd find some interesting bugs. One of the things I'm working on now is fuzzing of backbone protocols. FX had a really just head-smashing bug about 6 months ago or so, where with one of the trunking protocols, if you send it a different version number in the packet, then it dies. The router has a denial of service. That should so be caught in basic QA. And the fact that that works means that there's a lot of other stuff out there with anomalous input that is also likely to work. Exploit code versus the devices, we talked about that already, and strong mutual authentication. Right now, a lot of these devices do not have good crypto stacks. There's no way they can exchange certificates and actually understand each other. It's just not there. So if you want to work in the development side rather than the breaking things side, that's something that's worth checking out. And if you come across a backbone, you've tried all this stuff, you don't know what to do, and you're trying to figure out what to do next, look at everywhere you can input data or change the state of something. Try and figure out which ones of those will be useful to you. Useful could be denial of service, could be authentication bypass, it could just be your web hack. And a lot of the bugs that you're finding in backbone stuff, they're not like I came up with this brand new theory of BGP and no one has ever thought about it the way that I did. Unless you're Paul Watson, that's relatively unlikely. Most of the bugs that are out there are things that are known in other arenas and just someone ported it to infrastructure. So I think that's pretty much all of it. I think we have like 3 minutes if anyone has quick questions before the end. Questions? I see I've stunned you into silence, or it's before noon. All right.